Hey kids, it's time for Robert E. Howard's Secret Wars. This is a review of Conan Battle of the Black Stone. This is a 4-issue miniseries that just wrapped up. It's available at your local comic shop and online at Comixology/Amazon. Titan Comics puts out 2 ongoing Conan titles. One is Conan the Barbarian, which is their monthly color title, and then the other is Savage Sword of Conan, which you see over my shoulder, and that is a bi-monthly black and white magazine. This is a miniseries put out in addition to those 2 titles. This could have easily been the next plotline in Conan the Barbarian, and they just decided to publish it as a separate miniseries. It is a crossover event, so it has a lot of different Robert E. Howard characters, but unlike most comic book crossovers nowadays, you don't have to buy a bunch of tie-ins to understand the story. You can just pick up this miniseries and you'll be good. But if you need more, there is some great stuff in Savage Sword of Conan #4. This is a prologue that you see over my shoulder here, and it has these characters' first encounters with the Blackstone symbol. So I've already done a review of issue 1, and you might want to check that out. I'm not going to be redundant to that review here. In that review, I asked the question if this is going to be basically a rehash of the Serpent War, which was a Conan miniseries that was done over at Marvel a few years ago by the same writer, Jim Zub. And I will say that, in my opinion, no. There's a lot of differences here. I went through the similarities in my review of issue 1, and we're going to go through some of the differences that make this better. And honestly, the thing that this reminds me the most of is Marvel's Superheroes Secret Wars. And this was a neat miniseries. This was the first crossover event, and this is before they came up with the idea of making you buy a bunch of tie-in comics in the ongoing series. This was a miniseries you could pick up and enjoy all by itself, right? All 12 issues tell one single story with all these characters in it. And so in Secret Wars, the heroes and villains of the Marvel Universe are whisked away to an alien battlefield by an all-powerful force. And so there are some similarities to Battle for the Black Stone, but I'm not going to do a direct comparison because I figured out that would probably be unfair, because Secret Wars is written by my favorite writer, Jim Shooter, who had a few advantages that Jim Zub does not have with this new miniseries. First of all, he had 12 issues to write an epic story, and some of those issues were double-sized. So he had a lot more space than Jim Zub had with only 4 issues. Also, he had the advantage that all the characters in this miniseries appear in ongoing titles that have let the reader get to know these characters. Unfortunately, that is not the case with Battle of the Black Stone. And so I'm just going to say up front that this is the type of story that needs more than 4 issues. And I'm not saying anything feels shortchanged or left out because of the length of the miniseries, but it does feel like a story that is written to be intentionally small because it doesn't have a lot of space to be told. And it's also a story, in my opinion, that should have been done later, probably in a year or 2 after they've had time to establish all the characters in here before putting them together in a crossover. Now, I understand why it was done right now. I mean, when they were planning out their Conan run, they probably figured that interest would drop off after the first year and they would need to do a big crossover to kind of keep the momentum going and try to recapture people's interest. In actuality, this run of Conan has been more successful than anyone could have dreamed, and they probably could have waited, but I do understand why they wanted to do a crossover right now. So the story here is that Robert E. Howard's heroes throughout history, and I'll go over which ones are in here in a minute, they have all seen at some point in their life a symbol associated with the Black Stone, which is this evil magical thing. And so because they've all seen that symbol, this creature comes after them, and they all just inexplicably end up in Conan's time and have to fight this thing together. And that's pretty much the miniseries. But probably one of the weirdest parts of the miniseries is you cannot tell that any of that happened from most of the covers. So let's go over the covers real quick. So my review of issue 1, I've already talked about the first issue's cover. It's wonderful, but it doesn't tell you anything about the miniseries. Issue 2 is much better. I love this cover. It's just very dynamic, and it very clearly tells you, like, hey, Solomon Kane and Conan are going to meet and they're going to fight. And so with issue 3, we actually do get a hint of what this miniseries is about, except we only see 2 of the Howard characters, Solomon Kane, who was already on the second issue's cover, and then Brissa, who is actually a Conan character. And so it really doesn't even hint at the fact that this is a crossover with all of these different Robert E. Howard characters in it. And the monster is in the issue, right? This is the monster they fight in this miniseries. But the angle that's being used here, I honestly couldn't tell that it was a giant, right? I just thought it was roughly human sized, and it was just appeared larger because it's closer to the reader. I feel like this cover could have just been done better. And then this is issue 4, and I think this is a fantastic image. This is another one that if you sent me this as an art print, I would gladly put this on my wall. It is an awesome image of Conan, but it doesn't tell you anything about this story, and that's what a cover should do. It should be the tease for what happens inside. And that doesn't make it a spoiler. The point of a good cover is that you ask yourself, how did a character get in that situation? What does that situation mean for the character? And how are they going to get out of that situation? And here you don't ask any of that. It's just a Conan pinup. And so the interior artwork is by Jonas Scharf. And there are going to be people who probably think this is too stylized for Conan, and I understand that. But I would say the storytelling here is dynamic and clear, and this is the type of artwork that I'm very used to seeing on these types of Lovecraftian horror stories. It's very reminiscent of artwork I would see on Hellboy and BPRD. It's, very moody and has a lot of shadows and really does the horror aspects of the story very well. Because, again, this is a very Lovecraftian kind of story. And I think this artwork also goes well with all of the different time periods shown and all of the different characters that are here. And so we have Conan the Barbarian, Dark Agnes, the French swordswoman, Puritan adventurer Solomon Kane, Desert gunslinger El Barak, and the supernatural investigators Conrad and Kirwan. And I think all these characters look great, and the artwork is one of the things I have no complaints about. Looking at this as a Robert E. Howard story, I think most of the characters here are portrayed in an okay way, writing-wise. I think there's just not a lot of time for them to do anything because of the short length of the series. My one exception would be James Allison, who I personally feel like was a little bit wasted. James Allison is this character who remembers his lives as past barbarian heroes, but we don't get to see any of that here, and there is a completely different direction the character is taken in that I just don't feel like is as effective as how we normally see him. So let's go over some of those tropes that Secret Wars established that most crossovers don't bother doing that are actually part of Battle of the Black Stone. So first of all, this is a chance to get characters forced together in a different circumstance than normal and to see those different kinds of interactions that come out of that. And issue 3 actually slows down and lets our characters talk to each other and kind of reflect. And it's done very briefly. Each conversation is only a couple pages long, but it is kind of neat to see characters like Solomon Kane and Dark Agnes talk to each other and compare their experiences and just kind of reflect on where they're at. And so coming out of those interactions is always interesting to see who's going to like each other, who's not going to like each other, who's going to play ball, and who's going to try to go rogue and go on their own in these types of stories. And sometimes these interactions can lead to misunderstandings and fights. And so this one does actually check off that box quite well with a fight between Conan and Solomon Kane. That's pretty good. There's also the idea that it should get all these characters together to do something that they wouldn't be able to normally do. And, your mileage may vary on that, right? In my opinion, I probably would have liked to have seen each of the characters have more of a defined role in defeating the menace here, and for this menace to be a little bit better defined. And there's also the idea that the crossover event should change the characters, right? They should come back different than they left, right? It's like going to war, right? You're never going to come back and be quite the same person as when you left. And here, with the exception of a couple characters, most of them are pretty intact by the end of this thing, and it doesn't really feel like it has that much of an impact. Honestly, Lovecraftian style stories and monsters have just been really done to death lately. I'm especially thinking of Hellboy and BPRD, which I'm a huge fan of, and I love it to death. But since it's so super saturated in our culture at the moment, I think I would have liked to have seen something that really put more of a twist on those ideas and did something really different. But that being said, if you are familiar with Lovecraft type stories, you can probably infer what this creature's purpose is at the end, and perhaps the menace that was teased is not over and will be followed back up on. And speaking of which, the reveal of the character at the end was quite well done. There was a nice little surprise. I'm not going to spoil it. And it was accompanied by an article explaining the publication history of that character, who has appeared in, comics and stuff. But most people would probably know it from a video game, which is mentioned in that article. And by the way, that game has been released in a collection of video games on modern consoles that you might want to check out. And the article in the back of issue 4 was excellent, as always, but it did have a very minor mistake in there. Its point about horror comics reemerging in the 70s and that Robert E. Howard stuff was appearing in those comics was spot on. However, what it said about the first two appearances of Cole being in Creatures on the Loose and Monsters on the Prowl was just a little bit off. As I said in my guide to Cole comics that I did a few months ago, Creatures on the Loose number 10 is the first full appearance of Cole. But the second full appearance of Cole would have been in Cole the Conqueror number 1. Cole's appearance in Monsters on the Prowl number 16 didn't come out until after Cole number 2. And why was that? Because Cole was actually canceled after only 2 issues, and they were going to have him appear regularly in Monsters on the Prowl before they changed their mind and renewed the series, so it came back for issue 3. The publication history of the Cole series in the 70s is wild. I mean, that's not even the only time the series was canceled and brought back. I have learned so much from actually buying the individual issues and reading them all. And so I'm actually almost done with the Cole series from the 70s, and I'll have a review coming in the coming weeks with some handy reading tips for it that I've learned along the way. So you can look forward to that review of the sword and sorcery hero who would not die. And so my overall verdict on Battle of the Black Stone is that I don't think it's as good as the ongoing Conan titles they're putting out, but I think it's a pretty good comic. It's actually better than most crossovers have been over the years. Unfortunately, Secret Wars and Crisis on Infinite Earth kind of established a very high standard that most of them just don't live up to. They're mostly just cape checks and don't really tell much of a story. This is somewhere in between. This is somewhere in between being really great and just being a cape check, or I guess in this case, maybe a sword check. All right, so that's all my thoughts on Conan fighting over a black stone. All right, guys, like and subscribe for more videos. And until next time, see ya.